time for whatever is most terrifying to you, and some heartfelt zombies. Welcome to the depths. Welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for joining me today. Today I have another set of reviews for you. This is two short story collections that I'm going to review today. The first one is called The Rising, More Selected Scenes from the Apocalypse. This is by Brian Keene, and this was just recently published by Deathheads Press. And the second one is The Horror That Represents You. This is edited by S.D. Vassallo, and this is published by Brigids Gate Press, also in December of this year. I received complimentary copies of both of these in exchange for an honest review. So let's start with the first one, The Rising, More Selected Scenes from the Apocalypse. So this takes place in the world of The Rising, which is a zombie apocalypse world that Brian Keene created with the novel The Rising, which was published in 2003. I think he originally wrote it in 1998, I think he said. And there are a few other books in that series. There's another novel that came right after it called The City of the Dead. And then he published a collection of short stories. And then another novel that takes place at the time of the first one, I believe. But it's a story that couldn't fit into the first novel. And then a few other short stories or novellas in that world. And so this also takes place in that world. You don't have to have read any of those. All you have to know is that it is a zombie apocalypse, and it isn't like your normal zombie apocalypse. What happens is whenever anything dies, human or animal or anything, they return as a zombie, but they're actually possessed by some sort of demonic force. And that demonic force that's empowering them has all their memories and all their skill sets. And so, if someone has an AK-47 and is trying to kill a bunch of zombies and they die, then they return as a zombie who now has an AK-47. So it's a little more nefarious in that way, because these zombies have no interest in eating your brains. All they want to do is cause death and destruction. That's all you need to know going in to appreciate these. So it's just a bunch of short stories set in the zombie apocalypse. And some of them happen on like the day of the apocalypse. Some of them happen maybe a few weeks after it started, some a few months after it started. So this is a very short collection, but over the course of the collection, you see different phases of the zombie apocalypse happening, which is really exciting and fun. Now, I called these heartfelt zombie stories. And the reason for that is I think the story behind this collection is really moving, and you can feel that emotion in the stories themselves. So the story behind it and how it came to be was Brian Keene is friends with Christopher Triana, who is also an indie horror author. And Christopher Triana's dog, Bear, was diagnosed with a cancer and needed treatment. And in order to help fundraise money to provide treatment for Bear, Brian Keene decided to auction off short stories. So any of his fans could buy a short story for him, basically. And by winning this auction, he would agree to write you into a short story in The Rising. And so all of the short stories in this collection are from fans who donated money to have a story written about them. And so the proceeds of that would go to cancer treatment for Christopher Triana's dog, which I think is a really great example of how the horror community comes together and takes care of itself in really beautiful ways. I also think because of that, the treatment of the characters in these stories is great. Now, that's not to say bad things don't happen to them. Bad things happen to most of the characters. This world, the zombie apocalypse, is not a good place to be. And so bad, splatterpunk, bloody things happen to almost all of the characters. But they are crafted so lovingly. The characters feel really genuine. They feel real. And I think that's because they're real people. And so even though these are short stories, the characters all have these really wonderful quirks, such as what sports team is on their t-shirt, or what posters they have on their wall, or what specific music they listen to. And these weird little biographical details that I'm betting come directly from the people that won these auctions, right? But the great thing is, it never feels pandering. It never feels like these stories are just putting in Easter eggs or details for the sake of it. It feels like he's creating these really robust, interesting characters and then putting them in an awful situation and killing most of them. And so the characters, I think, have a lot of heart, and I really appreciated it. And it really felt, the whole collection feels heartfelt in that way. As I said before, it takes place at different times in the timeline of the zombie apocalypse, and I think that is exciting. I think it gives you a different chance to see what is going on and how to survive the first day of an apocalypse isn't the same way as how you survive, 1 month in. I think there is a decent amount of splatterpunk and gore and violence, if that is your bag. Anyone looking into zombie books, I think you're probably interested in that. In a lot of zombie stories, especially longer zombie stories, you end up looking at the survivors, the humans, right? And zombies are a reflection of humanity, and the real enemy is the human, usually. So these are short stories. That's not the case here. The enemy is the zombies because all they want to do is kill you. And they have your family and friends' memories. They have their skill sets. They know your name. They speak to you. And in that way, it's really terrifying. It's a version of zombies that is much different than everything else you see in zombie literature. You usually don't have zombies that have all your loved ones' memories and try to guilt you into unlocking the door so they can, shove a knife through your face. And so honestly, I enjoyed every one of these stories. It's a really short collection. I do wish it was a little longer. The stories all felt different. They were inventive, and none of them felt like they were treading the same ground, even though they were dealing with the same theme. There wasn't a lot of representation. I think to some extent, that's because this is a self-selected audience of characters. You have to be pre-existing fans of Brian Keene's, and you have to have the disposable income that you are able to spend on buying yourself a short story, essentially. And so there is like a self-selection process. So the characters weren't widely diverse. I think it would have been useful if he had added maybe even like a half dozen additional stories to maybe just play out the runtime a little of this collection a little more, because it was too short. I enjoyed it. I was having fun in this world. I would have liked to see more of it. And if he had written a few additional stories, he wouldn't have been beholden to the fans that had bought those stories. So he could have done different things with those, whether that be make them more diverse or just be meaner to the characters. Because there were, even though really awful things did happen to some of the characters, it still felt awful things happening in a very loving way. There wasn't the kind of cynicism and really dark-heartedness that you see in some splatterpunk, and he could have done some of that if he had added a few extra stories. But when your biggest complaint of a collection is that it needs more stories, then that's usually a good sign. I had a lot of fun with this collection. It made me interested in reading more of Brian Keene's work. I'm hoping to read the Rising series now, the original series that started this, and so I think if you like zombie horror and you like short stories, you can't miss with this one. It is heartfelt zombie stories. And I should say that even though these stories are filled with splatter and gore and awful things happening, the beautiful part of them is the emotional quality of them. And not just the meta narrative of why these stories are written, but within the stories, the way the living characters care for each other and the emotions and relationships that are the source or power for what actions they do take are really, really resonant and really well developed, even in such a short word count. And so it was, like I said, it's very heartfelt for more than one reason, not just for the meta aspect of why this collection came to be, but even within the stories, there is a lot of emotion. There's a lot of heart. And he manages to find heart in the middle of this really terrible apocalyptic scenario. So if you like zombie stories, if you like short fiction, I think that this collection is great. I had fun with the whole collection. I definitely recommend it. Now, the other anthology collection I want to talk about today is The Horror That Represents You. And this is edited by S.D. Vassallo. And so when I received a copy of this, I didn't recognize any of the authors' names. And I was a little worried. I like anthologies that have a theme. But the theme of this one was what scares you. And that hardly feels like a strong theme for a horror anthology. Yeah, I love independent horror. I think there's a lot of great independent horror short stories. So I had an open mind, but I was still a little bit trepidatious going into this. I thought it was a weird, kind of lackluster theme, and I didn't recognize any of the names. And I have to say, I was blown away. I had a great time with every story in this collection. The stories felt intimate and personal, and the theme of what scares you actually really pulled them together in a way that I was not expecting. Across the stories, you have some body horror. There's a little bit of, splatter and gore mixed in, not a lot. You have some really interesting sci-fi horror. There is a little bit of supernatural elements mixed in, but mostly there is the psychological horror. That is the underlining current through most of the stories. And I think just the level of intimacy and like reflective quality that came up in these stories is what really bound them together in a way that I thought they were great. I had a really wonderful time with this collection. I will say the really interesting thing is that even though the theme is a little bit nebulous for this, somehow within this one collection, there are two short stories that feature Greek grandmothers. And I have never in my life before read a horror story that has a Greek grandmother as like a central plot point. And somehow there were two of them in this collection, one by a Greek author, but the other one was a non-Greek author. And yet both of them were great. One of them nearly had me to tears. And when you can have a short horror story that brings up all those emotions because it's looking at the relationships you have with those you love and as they're leaving or as they want to leave but they can't, there's a lot there. And I thought these were beautiful, beautiful stories. I just thought it was a little bit ironic that I've never read a horror story with a Greek grandmother before, and all of a sudden I have two of them. As I said, even though this collection is a little bit nebulous, it scratches at all of your insecurities, all of your doubts, all of your fears. it manages to run the gamut of what it could be that unsettles you, and it pokes at it just a little bit. Most of the stories are pretty conventional in their tone. There's one story that I thought was really brilliant, the sci-fi story, and the whole story is written as a bunch of reviews, like Yelp reviews, essentially. I won't say more than that, but it was a really creative and inventive way to explore narrative, and I really enjoyed that. There were 24 stories in this collection, and I enjoyed every single one of them, honestly. A few of them really stood out, and a few of them were, 5-star reads for me, but none of them dropped below 3 stars. They were all in that range between 3 and 5 stars. So from my side, I think this is a really strong collection. I had a lot of fun with it. I think 24 stories is just about the perfect length for a collection. It gives you a wide range. You don't feel like you are trapped into, reading this anthology forever and ever and ever. And yet there's enough space for diversity that you can get a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a couple different flavors in the mix. And I think this collection does that well. It has a diverse group of writers, diverse genres that it's playing with, yet they all do feel intimate and personal and like they have something to say about what it means to be a human in difficult times. And so because of that, I really, really enjoyed this collection. And I think you will too, if you give it a chance. I think that's all I have to say about these two short horror collections to talk about this week. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you've read anything by Brian Keene, ever since reading this, I read a short novella about vampires by him, which I thought was great. And I'm really interested in reading more by him. So if you have read anything by him, I'd love to hear what your recommendations are down in the comments. And the horror that represents us, this was put out by Brigids Gate Press, and they're quickly becoming one of my favorite indie presses. I've gotten a number of books from them, and I really enjoy all of them. So if you've read any of this collection or anything else by that publisher, I'd love to hear your recommendations also down in the comments. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.